welcome to session number 6. We're plowing through these at good pace. Today, we are going to establish that the financial obligations of the U.S. government, along with those of many other governments, are so large that they are unpayable in money of current purchasing power. And furthermore, there's only a few options open to our politicians to deal with this problem. None of those options are pleasant or easy in any way. So that's why I titled this lesson, Uncle Sam's Unpayable Debt. And I'm going to make the case that, that the U.S. government is approaching a point where its traditional methods of gathering money by taxing and borrowing to keep the promises of the politicians are really no longer available or approaching that point. The traditional taxing and borrowing are approaching an upper limit. So further funding through those channels in the traditional ways is going to become impossible. So that's today. Now, next week, we're going to zero in on the reason we're doing this is next week we'll zero in on the most likely actions that the politicians are going to take to address that problem. And in preview, one of their main strategies is going to be what a lot of economists call financial repression. That's already underway. And it's a situation in which politicians, policymakers will basically let inflation run while simultaneously suppressing interest rates. Now, spoiler alert, you will not benefit from financial repression. But understanding how the politicians may do this, how I think they're going to do this, is going to put us all in a better position to counteract their tactics. So that's why I call session 7, Money Creation, the Disease and the Cure, because I think government's going to use its ability to control money creation in an attempt to solve the very problems it caused by excess money creation. And then finally, lesson 8 is going to be it's going to be called Surviving Financial Repression, and I'll try to go in detail into what to do about it. You know, this is going to be, that will be your cash value for staying with this course for 8 weeks. And we'll discuss how we can survive and maybe possibly even prosper in this financial sort of repression era. All right, so let me share my screen here, if I can remember how to do this. I always have to reinvent the wheel. Okay, I know, Mark, you're saying I should get automatic with it, right? Yes, I should. I admit. Okay, let's see. And share. There we go. Okay. So that's where we're headed. But so now let's preview today's agenda a little bit. Let's explore today the government's debt problem by asking these 2 questions. And in part 1, we'll explore the government's the basic U.S. the facts of U.S. financial obligations and show how completely outlandish they are. And I want to demonstrate why the U.S. government's financial obligations can't be paid in current dollars, sort of prove that to you. And then in the second part of today, we'll look at the problem of financing government from the professional politician's point of view. And the purpose of that is to get an idea of how they see it and therefore what they think their realistic options are to deal with the problem. Now, we've already spent a lot of time illustrating that bad money creation at the hands of the Fed, which is known as QE, and which turned trillions of dollars of debt into money and suppressed interest rates in the process. We've already illustrated that that's one of the main problems and has led to this big budget problem. And this quote from David Stockman, who's the former budget director under Ronald Reagan many years ago, is a good summary, I think. And by the way, this is not expensive. Stockman is a pretty good economist, especially when it comes to the budget and money creation. His statements are a little bit outlandish sometimes, prone to hyperbole, so beware. But his information and his data is good. All right, so my basic argument is that the government debt is so large it can't be legitimately paid off, meaning it can only be paid off in dollars of very diminished purchasing power. And so I want to explain why I think this is so. And to start, let's start off with our old friend Margaret Thatcher. And she famously said, the trouble with socialism is you eventually run out of other people's money. And this phrase became really popular because it's intuitively insightful. The idea that there's only so much money, and all of it belongs to someone who already earned it, and the government has to tax the people some way to get it. And now, whether you were sympathetic to socialism or not, obviously I'm not, and you're not, but whether you are or not, that statement seems true, because the fact is, if you keep taking wealth from productive people to give it to unproductive people, you'll eventually reach the limit on the wealth that you can redistribute. And so Thatcher actually understated, I think, the problem of other people's money, because in the 70s, what she had in mind was that governments had already taxed people to their limit. In other words, her premise was that because there's a limit on taxation, which limits government revenue, this puts a limit on how much wealth can be redistributed. And that is what I think many people still think, that, socialism or mandatory wealth redistribution is simply taxing Peter to pay Paul. But taxation is just one of the ways that governments can redistribute wealth. Taxation is the most visible, and I think it's therefore the most honest way to gather and redistribute public wealth. But there are other less honest redistribution kind of techniques, including taking on too much government debt and then paying it back with depreciated currency, which, without the lenders or the citizens really realizing that they're being shortchanged by inflation. Now, the problem today is that we're not just running out of other people's money, we're running out of other people's wealth. Whether you're talking about taking it by taxing or borrowing, our government has really, at this point, taxed and borrowed so much that the ability to gather any significant additional government revenue has reached a kind of a boundary, sort of a new frontier. And I'm not talking about the legal limit on the federal debt that Congress haggles over every time they want to raise the debt ceiling. I'm referring to the total of the government's future obligations, which we're going to get into, which are literally unpayable. And that will ultimately, I think, require a step change in our whole welfare state. So let's dig in a little bit now into how this situation came about. I think it originates from this problem. Our government continually takes on more and more debt through this recursive process that's fueled by the politicians' incentive to maintain power. I mean, to fulfill their promises, the politicians throw public money at social problems, whether those problems are real or imagined, by taxing and borrowing. And whether they're talking about wiping out sickness or ending poverty or stopping the seas from rising, they promise to solve all kinds of unsolvable problems by spending hundreds of billions of dollars of public money. And this process, unfortunately, keeps them in office, because making these promises and throwing money at these problems is popular enough among voters to get these heavy spending politicians reelected year after year. Now, just as an aside to this audience, and you realize that fundamentally this is a moral and cultural problem that's fueled by altruism and ignorance. But that kind of deep philosophical analysis is beyond the scope of this course. I'm sticking to economics. So just so you know, I'm very aware of that. Anyway, this continuous cycle of promises and spending eventually has encouraged the politicians to grow the cost of their promises faster than they can gather the revenue to pay for those promises. First they did what Margaret Thatcher noticed. They taxed individuals and corporations, raising taxes as high as the voters would allow. And then when taxes got so high as to become unpopular, threatening the politicians' careers, they borrowed money from savers and they borrowed money from investors by issuing more and more government bonds. And when they run out of bond buyers at low interest rates, they resort to monetizing government debt, which, as we know in this class, consists of most recently, of central banks directing the commercial banks to buy bonds and creating new money, bank deposits in the process. In other words, they resort to inflation, which in my view is properly understood as money creation caused by government action. Just by way of quick review, here's a chart that we showed last time, which superimposes the Fed's asset purchases in the blue line, in the red line, which is also money creation, along with the total money supply. They're read on different scales, but you can see they mirror each other. And this is the leading example of unproductive money creation, quantitative easing, which occurred from 2009 to 2022. And we all know the story there. The Fed made the commercial banks create an unprecedented amount of money, which funded the unprecedented deficits by lowering interest rates and monetizing a very large amount of government debt. Now, the ability to monetize debts like this at low interest rates, I think, gave Congress the idea that they could get away with more borrowing indefinitely, resulting in a huge increase in debt in just recent years. Incidentally, these same policies were followed by other central banks in almost all countries. So just how high is this debt in the USA? Well, all you have to do is look at usdebtclock.org. You can do it right now if you want. You can see that it's spinning all the time. I took this off the screenshot yesterday, and the U.S. debt, what we call the funded debt, is just under $34 trillion and growing fast. It's increased by $2 trillion just in the last year. And this is called this debt here, shown here, is called the funded debt. In other words, this is money that has already been borrowed by the U.S. Treasury market and not yet paid back. And that's a big number. And 34 trillion, I don't know about you, that's hard for me to grasp. And it's sort of the kind of number that you normally use in physics classes when you're talking about light years or quantities of subatomic particles or something. So how do you put that into units that are understandable for a normal person? So per capita, this very big number comes to about $100,000 in debt per U.S. citizen. So let's just imagine the average citizen now is tasked to pay off his share of the existing national debt. As you'll see from this same display, the median personal income of Americans is about $36,000 annual personal income. So how long would it take for the average earner to pay off $100,000 in debt? Now, even if this average person cut his personal consumption by 10%, which I submit he really can't do because he's living hand to mouth. Just suppose he took $3,600 and paid it off every year and to pay this debt off. It would take him nearly 28 years to pay off his $100,000 debt, which doesn't even include interest on the debt. So the math is $100,000 by 3,600 equals almost 28 years. Now that sounds impossible to me. That's just the first cut. This is a chart of the growth of U.S. national debt. And please notice the phases in the rate of growth that show up in the slope of the line. You can see it in phases. The slope keeps getting steeper. You had modest growth up until 2000. From 1990 to 2000, this debt grew at about 8% per year. From 2001 to 2008, at 9.2% per year. That's up to the large gray line, recession line there. From 2008 to 2020, the big QE years, the national debt grew at 12% per year. And during the last two pandemic years, and this doesn't even go up to 23, debt increased by 17.7% per year. And if you recall the money supply chart, this chart looks very similar to the chart of money supply, which of course to this class is no coincidence. Now, from another perspective, you could look at the debt and how it grew from the first 22 years of the 21st century, last 22 years, and it grew by the debt grew by 445%, while nominal GDP grew by only 260%. So obviously we have an accelerating problem. Now this chart here shows the ratio of federal debt to gross domestic product. This is the debt to GDP ratio. And it's grown from only 30% in 1980 to over 120% in the last few years. The little spike on the right is the pandemic years, which kind of reflects the the brief, sharp reduction of income caused by reduction of GDP caused by the pandemic-related economic slowdown, and then accompanied by the rising nominal GDP due to the pandemic stimulus. So that's what put that big anomaly there. Now, debt to GDP is the most widely quoted, most popular measure of the debt burden. GDP, of course, encompasses all income for both businesses and individuals. So to put this in personal terms, debt to GDP is similar to measuring your personal debt against your personal income. So it's like your personal GDP. So if your annual income was, say, $100,000 and your total debt was $10,000, you say you had, and say that's a loan with just to make these numbers easy, say that's a loan with an interest rate of 10%. In other words, yearly interest payments of $1,000. Your lender would probably say you're a reasonable credit risk for more lending, a little more anyway, because your debt to income ratio is only 10%. And more importantly, the percentage of your income that goes to pay for interest is only 1%. That's $1,000 in interest divided by $100,000 in income. So, in other words, the interest payments divided by income is sometimes called an insolvency ratio. And we're going to see why it's called that in a little bit. So this level of income would be kind of in line with, remember our lesson 3, our example of a consumer loan taken and then paid off pretty easy out of future income. Now, but if your debt was $100,000, or if your debt was $100,000 or 100% of your annual income, your annual interest charges at 10% would give you an insolvency ratio of 10%. In other words, paying 10% of your income for interest. And that would definitely start badly, probably eat into your savings, and would likely prevent you from accumulating any savings at all to provide for you in the future. Now, at this point, you're approaching a debt trap when this insolvency ratio, in this example, is only 10%, unless you can figure out how to earn more money. I personally wouldn't lend you money at this level of income and debt. Now, if your debt went up to $200,000, your debt to income ratio would go to 200%, and your insolvency ratio would rise to 20%. Now, if your income is still $100,000 under these conditions, it's likely you can't even afford to pay the debt anyway. And no responsible lender would ever give you this much money unless you had very significant collateral that could be, repossessed. All right. So now this problem, this insolvency ratio of the government, is addressed very well in a article that I just saw this morning from the Cobden Center. I've referenced it here, and you can take a look at it if you want. It's quite good. The point is that there's a level of debt where interest payments overtake your ability to service that debt. This is true for individuals, it's true for sovereign nations. And today, the insolvency ratio of the US government is a little over 20%, but it's going to rise rapidly as maturing federal debt is rolled over at higher interest rates. And it'll be even worse if the government's revenue falls due to a recession. And again, this article does a good job of laying out the problem. So $34 trillion in debt, or $100,000 per citizen, is a terrible number. And you hear this debt number thrown around all the time as Congress does its periodic kabuki dance of, arguing about increasing the authorized debt ceiling. I say kabuki dance because nobody on either side of the aisle does anything about it. They just refund. They fight about it, but no one, with very few exceptions, no one resists. All right, so that's the funded debt. But wait, it is actually way worse than this. And I'm going to take you now for 10 minutes and wade into the morass. So, get ready. 34 trillion is really only a minor part of the US government's total financial obligations. 34 trillion is what the government owes to current owners of treasury bonds. But there's a lot more unfunded debt out there. And although nobody knows the exact number, it's a huge number. And I want to now explore this unfunded debt and show you how to estimate it. And you can only estimate it so you have some confidence in the urgency of this problem. Now, just consider the unfunded obligations, the unfulfilled obligations that politicians have made. These are mainly promises to pay future entitlements: Social Security, disability payments, Medicare, Medicaid. These entitlements are about 70% of the total annual federal budget. And they're real promises, they're real expectations, they're written into federal law with annual cost of living escalators based on the Consumer Price Index built in by legislation. But they're mandatory, but they are not funded, meaning the government has not yet taxed or borrowed from anyone to pay for them. And this means these future obligations are not included in these government debt numbers. The 34 trillion includes money that's already been borrowed and spent. That's why it's called funded and now has to be paid back. But every year, what was a future obligation becomes a current obligation. And to pay these rolling new obligations, the government is unable to raise enough tax, so it borrows the amount needed in the treasury market. And that amount is called the annual deficit, and it adds, to the total federal debt outstanding. Here's what the deficit looks like through time. You can see we ran a little surplus back here in the late 1990s, or right around 2000. And I had to throw that statement in there. Vice President Dick Cheney in 2003, Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. Anyway, this is how the deficit looks. It's, what's this number? It's huge. It's 2 trillion. Just in this year alone. And 2023 is not even on this chart. It's not up yet on the Fed's data. So just so you understand what this, I think you all understand. Tell me if you don't understand what this deficit means. Every year, this vertical bar, negative vertical bar, gets added to the previous federal debt number. So deficits are the reason the $34 trillion number keeps going up. And these deficits are going to continue to be very large. The Congressional Budget Office, which has a history of estimating too conservatively or underestimating our deficit spending, projects significant deficits as far as the eye can see, and their projections go out for about 30 years. Now, please understand, this deficit is very different from other famous historical deficits. For example, to pay for World War II, the USA and many other nations borrowed a lot of money, way more than they could have raised in taxes. And this borrowing financed, planes and tanks and submarines and soldiers' wages and so forth. And these are expenses which ended when the war ended. So wartime debts were one-time costs. So when we scrapped the tanks and the planes and the war ended and the soldiers returned to work, these debts could be paid off fairly quickly through various means, some inflation, some repression, and then the final financial obligation was extinguished. But our current annual deficits are very different because they recur every year. They are chronic because they're an attempt to fund this open-ended obligation to provide retirement and medical benefits to every citizen, everyone alive and everyone yet unborn, until the day they die. There's no end in sight. The medical and disability benefits are actually physical goods and services with no known limit or cost. So, and the monetary promises have cost of living escalators built in by law. And under current law, these obligations have to be paid. So the next question becomes, how do we estimate a current monetary value, what we call a present value, on these future deficits? I almost said defecations, which is probably better, which we know will occur. In financial terms, we can estimate the present value of these future deficits. The objective being to illustrate just how massive these obligations are. So don't get scared of a little math here, but here we go. To estimate the present, just a first cut at estimating the present value of future deficits. The deficit for FY fiscal year 2023, which ended on September 30, clocked in at 2 trillion. And if you want, you can look at the CBO website if you want to. I'll include it in the manuscript to look at their estimates of future deficits. But the recently updated numbers project the deficit to grow to 2.7 trillion by 2033, raising the funded debt held by Congress to 47 trillion. So let's be conservative and assume an annual deficit of only 1.5 trillion. And let's just say this repeats annually for a long time in the future. And then let's ask ourselves, what would it cost today to make this a funded liability? In other words, what amount of debt in today's dollars would pay for those future obligations? So, in other words, what we're doing here on this slide is we're asking what amount of money the government would need today to invest to pay out 1.5 trillion annually for long into the future, sort of indefinitely. All right. So if we could earn a return of 5% on this investment, we'll need $30 trillion, because 5% of $30 trillion is 1.5 trillion. So, now you add that 30 trillion to the 34 trillion of that's already funded debt, and you get a real debt as a first cut of 64 trillion. So that's a quick back of the envelope calculation of total government financial obligations. But wait, that number needs to be higher because it assumes a constant deficit of 1.5 trillion. That's 1.5 trillion in today's dollars, but we can be sure that the nominal deficit is going to grow every year due to inflation. That's what the CBO assumes. All right. So this will look, I think this is going to look realistic, or not realistic. This is going to look familiar to Mark, perhaps not to the others, but let's use a little math from Finance 101 called the Gordon Growth Model. It's the Gordon Growth Model to estimate the present value of a growing future deficit stream. And this is the present value of long-term income stream that grows at a constant rate every year. So let's just say the deficit grows at 3% a year, which is very conservative because it's been growing much faster than that. CBO projects much faster than that. If we start with this baseline deficit of 1.5 trillion today and grow it at 3% annually, this means the annual deficit would be 2 trillion in 10 years and 2.7 trillion in 20 years. And this means we have an increasing deficit every year that we have to discount back at 5% annually to arrive at our present value. So the formula for calculating this present value of the future income stream from our imagined investment is given by this equation, the Gordon Growth Model. And it is, so, I mean, you can sort of follow it. This 1.5 trillion is the current annual cash cost of these deficits in today's dollars. It's also equal to the return on the required investment because it just funds the annual additional debt and no more. Then G, the G is the annual growth rate of this deficit. In other words, today's deficit grows at 3% per year. And then R is the yearly rate of return we assume, which is 5%. Now we have to solve for how much we would have to invest today to get the money to cover the projected deficit and its growth and everything. So this works out mathematically to 75 trillion today in terms of what you would have to invest. That's the investment we'd have to make today to earn a 5% return that would fund all future deficits if they're at today's dollars of 1.5 trillion. This is called the present value of a future stream of annual deficits. You know, that would be the formal name. Now, I have included in the manuscript, if you want to derive this Gordon Growth Model, a nice video that shows how it's done. It's not complicated if you've had Math 101. Honestly, it's not. All right, so that's my quick back of the envelope estimate of the national debt. But you know, 75 trillion plus, what did I get? What did I get back here? 75 trillion plus 34, 109 trillion. These numbers just, they mean almost nothing. Just so you know, I'm not being, I don't know, outrageous here. Here's two other estimates. One most recently on the right there, from the Cato Institute last year, when the federal debt was much lower. So, you know, what I'm doing, I think, is quite conservative. But my sample calculation is not important. I promise you, it's wrong. I offer it to just illustrate that even with conservative assumptions, these obligations cannot be paid. The main value of this exercise is to give you a rough method of estimating the magnitude of what we're obligated to spend in the future. And it's only a ballpark approximation based on rough assumptions about future interest rates, investment returns, the growth of deficits, and so forth. And you can find lots of other estimates. But the real point is, although it's only approximate, this huge investment required to fund future obligations is instructive, because immediately you see it's an impossible investment. It's impossible. Can you even imagine the possibility of funding now, today, a 75 trillion investment, $75 trillion of a single investment? That's about 3 times the current annual US GDP, and it's over 3 times the US broad money supply. On a per capita basis, assuming this funded debt plus unfunded debt, in my estimate, is 109 trillion, that is a debt of over 9 times the annual income of the average US citizen. And that's obviously literally impossible for anyone to do. Now you compare this 100+ trillion debt to the estimated wealth of the whole world. Today's broad money supply is only around 100 trillion, and the global financial GDP, everyone added up together, is only about 110 trillion. It's obviously not possible to invest the entire world's money supply to pay for the deficits of the US government. There's simply not enough investment money, and there are not enough investment opportunities available to fund this kind of obligation. I mean, it's one thing to borrow money to fund a project that'll pay back the interest and principal, and you fund the investment, Mark, I think you're in this business, by selling bonds or equity to raise the money, and the investors lend or buy stock with their savings in the expectations of earning a return. And that's what we have already done with our currently funded 34 trillion. Savers have loaned the government money to pay for the things that are already consumed, and now the government has to pay the lenders back. But these future entitlements, these promises, are unfunded precisely because they cannot be funded. You could not sell enough bonds today to cover this investment. You cannot borrow enough to fund these liabilities legitimately, because the total wealth required to support future payments of this magnitude is not ours to use. All the world's balance sheets combined won't pay for those promises. The deficits, if they were allowed somehow continue, would consume more wealth than the world could allocate to them. So, I mean, it should be evident that if these big numbers are going to be paid out, the only way it can happen is if there's a lot more money to pay out. In other words, if these dollar amounts are going to be paid, they have to be paid off in inflated, i.e., depreciated dollars. So 20 years from now, you might get an annual Social Security check of $100,000, but maybe it'll only buy the eggs and groceries and cars that $20,000 buys today, and likely will buy less in actual goods and services than you can buy with $20,000 today.
Jim?
All right, so yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, I get the point that there's
am I beating this horse too dead, Mark?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I get that. Okay, there's more debt out there than there is money to make good on it, if you look at it now. And so so the only way to ever make good on it is going to be some type of inflating the government's way out of it. So is there a metric or measurement of that would make it real in terms of like the rate of inflation that the government is really already committed to, just based on the debt that's out there? I'm just thinking of ways to make this more real, because people can look at those charts and they can hear the numbers, and it's overwhelming, and then the fallback is, well, but it's worked so far and it hasn't blown up, and you never really know exactly what event is going to trigger a blow up. But I'm just thinking of putting it in terms that do make it more real, like I said, the rate of inflation that would be needed. as of now before you even incur more obligations like the government's likely to do.
Well, one problem is that the calculation of the deficits as it currently is recursive, meaning you can assume you can put in inflation rates, but the inflation rate you put in is also going to increase the obligation because these obligations, the 70% of the budget, is tied to a calculated inflation rate that's based on the CPI. So yes, you can do it, but I think what you'll find is, I know what you'll find. I have actually tried to do this, and it's you go crazy because of all the assumptions.
Oh, I see what you mean, because you move one thing and then it triggers something else, which in this case is invariably worse, right?
And then as we're going to see, as you continue borrowing, how do you continue borrowing? How do you bet on the bond market continuing to fund when interest costs start to eat up the entire budget? Which is we're going to get into in a minute. Now, interesting, you just mentioned a blow up. And so we have a lot today, mostly conservative pundits and so forth, who like to talk about our big federal debt in terms like the debt bomb, in which, the level of debt somehow reaches a flashpoint and explodes, destroying everything in sight. But I don't think that's a very good analogy. I think what we have is more like a debt swamp, where you kind of walk in and slowly get dragged, down under slowly in the quicksand. It's very tough to identify the point at which you're doomed, but the point at which there's no going back. So being aware of these big numbers is instructive, but it doesn't help too much if you want to know how this growing debt's going to affect you personally. And furthermore, I think these dramatic numbers don't mean much in the real world, because politicians are in control of funding and spending, and they don't think in these terms. So that's going to bring me to my next point. To know what I think they're going to do about it, I think we have to know at least how they think about funding the government. How do they approach the problem? And that's what I kind of want to cover in the next section.
And I think it is relevant, right? Because like a bomb kind of implies like hyperinflation, whereas the swamp is kind of more like the muck we've been in, right? Where progress we make in terms of productivity is offset by inflation. And so we wind up without the kind of growth that we would otherwise have, right?
Yes. I mean, the more you tax, the lower the growth. The more you borrow and crowd out, boy, we get into, I want to keep this straightforward and, not introduce too many simultaneous variables. But you're leading right into what of the politicians' alternatives are. So here's how you face, as far as I know, this is how you face a debt problem if you're a sovereign government. You can basically outright default on your debts. That's when the government reneges on all or some of its promises. The government just admits it can't pay. They say, oops, we or the previous, may blame it on someone else. We or the previous government just overpromised. And now we confess we cannot pay our debts, so we won't. So an example of this is we cut Medicare and way back and eliminate Social Security entirely. But of course, we keep the taxes in place because we have to, pay for other promises. Now, I think this is unlikely, because the first politicians who propose this are going to lose their careers. This option, to me, evokes the world of pitchforks and torches that are going to come out if you tell people they're not getting their health care or their disability or their Social Security. Now, this is the honest alternative, default, but it's also a very poor outcome for the people in power. So I maintain that outright default on U.S. debt is not an option at least it's not the first thing the politicians are going to try. All right. Option two is inflation, severe, probably, or hyperinflation. Governments, like Mark's saying, they can pay off debts with made up depreciated currency that's obviously worth much less than the value of the debt they owe. And, we have Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe and Venezuela as arch examples. Under this scenario, the economy is likely to collapse. Everyone suffers. Out come the pitchforks and torches. And it could be a very bad outcome for everyone, including the people in power. And it often sets the stage for dictatorship. So we got to hope. I think this won't happen, not because I got my head in the sand, but I think it's not going to be our fate. And I'll get into this shortly. The third option is severe austerity. Usually involves some default, selective default, but the government raises taxes severely and cuts back on, many of its future promises. And the government will try to raise taxes at least, but the main thing is the government in this option tries to limit its expenses to what it can collect in taxes. Now, this is close to what Greece did for the last 10 years. And they will say little old Greece made progress. Things are a little better there now than they were back in 2012. But of course, under this option, you have to cut services that are being funded by borrowing. So you risk miscalculating about, if you're a politician, about which promises you can break and which promises you have to keep and still keep your job. This is a very bitter pill for everybody, politically dangerous for politicians. So I think it's unlikely to be, at least certainly not the sole solution to our debt problem. And the last one is my favorite because it's all encompassing: smoke and mirrors. You pay off debts in a depreciating currency while artificially holding your finance costs down. Artificially, I mean by inflation. And this is recovery by fooling most of the people some of the time. The most favored version of this is, to my knowledge, financial repression, which kind of spreads the pain by letting inflation run fairly high, keeping interest rates below the inflation rate. And it's one you can implement incrementally, and it's the least painful policy of choice when you're dealing with this very big public debt. So
Jim,
you're
before
probably,
you go on, I wanted to ask about a potential fifth option, which is
yeah.
looting. Um, I
Isn't
mean,
these are all examples of looting, right?
right, but I mean, like actual initiation of, like violent looting. Um,
Mm.
I don't know how likely that is in the United States, but isn't that kind of what Putin was doing by trying to conquer Ukraine? Just kind of grab
Um,
some stuff?
I think he was and is, but I don't think his motive is financial. Russia does not have a big sovereign debt problem like this.
That's fair. I mean, can you maybe off the cuff say how likely it would be for the United States to start commandeering um assets, either domestically or foreign assets?
Well, it'd be just easier to kill people, wouldn't it? So I'm not being flippant. It would be easier just to say, "Oh, I've got all these obligations in the future. I know one way to get rid of them. If they're not alive, I don't have to pay them." What would you consider an out and out wealth tax, a confiscation of wealth? Would you consider that looting? I would. I think
I would,
that's
well, and there's a sense in which it's exactly what you just said with regard to murder. Um if you're taking away money that would otherwise be invested in medical research, for example.
Yeah,
that's going to kill people a lot faster.
you can see the progressive policies here are on a spectrum of, violence to people, from simple taxation to all the way to, what I've sort of flippantly proposed there. The violations of rights are progressive, from simple taxation all the way to murder. So it's very hard for me to answer you if you ask. I don't mean to be dramatic here, but it's very hard for me to answer your question about looting, because this is all looting a question in degree. My premise
And
is
it's
they'll
all,
only go.
I mean, let's imagine for a moment that they did find some way to actually kill people to whom they had obligation. Those dead people, don't pay taxes for very long. So ultimately it's self-defeating,
You
kind of
know,
like everything else you're
right,
describing.
Megan, but they've already paid their taxes typically, and they're typically now living off either their savings or the taxes they paid into a social security system. So you're talking about, I mean, the arch example would be, you've seen it in science fiction stories. Somebody's over 75, send them to the incinerator. I'm getting close to the incinerator. If that's, I only got 3 months to live. So,
We're gonna surround you with fire extinguishers, Jim.
thank you. That makes me feel well. All right. So that's, let's see how we're doing on time here. I want to be sure to, okay. Well, I think I have enough time to get through this next part. Let's think in detail about how politicians think about federal spending, and I want to point out pinpoint where the problem in the spending is. I apologize for repeating this. Politicians think only, in my opinion, in the short term. At least that is, with some exceptions, their incentive is to think short term, meaning my current political term or maybe the next election. And when they think of funding the budget, they don't care about big aggregate numbers like 34 trillion or 100 trillion. They think in terms of year-to-year cash flow. That's what keeps them going. So their frankly cynical question to themselves is, how will I get the money this year and maybe next year to pay for the promises I made, so that I can keep my job, keep my salary and benefits, and then somehow sail into the sunset and not get blamed when things ultimately fall apart. I mean, that's, with a few exceptions, this is the incentive many respond to. And from that point of view, the annual cash flow approach is useful, because you can tweak the sources and uses of cash incrementally as the financial pressures intensify. And that's what you're going to see. Okay. So this is an elected legislator's simplified cash flow format here, which we want to now use to discover how politicians, I think, are going to attempt to keep their promises in the face of an impossibly high debt level. Okay. So they basically have four levers to pull here. To make ends meet. They can reduce promises, they can reduce interest costs, they can raise taxes, and they can increase borrowing. So let's first look at the sources of cash, which are taxes and borrowing. There's constraints on these sources. I just want to say right out front, borrowing is limited, and the demand for treasury bonds is not only limited by the appetite for investing out there, but it's limited by the interest rate that the government needs to pay as an incentive for people to lend them cash. And so those two are intricately tied together. We're going to come back to interest expenses in a few minutes. But there's limits on taxes too. And maybe they can go up a little bit, but I now want to show you why I think we're going to see inflation. I'm going to illustrate it with the taxes. So it's logical that they're going to try to find a way to pay or appear to pay all these entitlements to the people, at least in nominal dollars. But I'm saying I don't think the nominal payouts to voters are going to be, the nominal payouts are not going to be reduced, except for some groups whose votes don't matter. For example, they may reduce Social Security payments to wealthy people who don't have enough votes to affect an election, but those kind of cuts wouldn't make a big dent in their card, spending anyway. But let's look at the limitations on taxes. Now, in the fiscal year just finished, Congress raised about $4 trillion in revenue. That's taxes, income taxes, capital gains taxes, social payroll taxes, various fees. They raised about $4 trillion that way, and they spent about $6 trillion. So there's the $2 trillion deficit. So how much money can they raise in taxes? Can they increase taxes enough to cover their increased spending needs? Now, this chart here, I think, is very instructive. The problem with that idea is that for 75 years, tax receipts or government revenues, total revenues, as a percentage of the US GDP have been pretty constant at just under 20%. So higher tax rates don't necessarily result in higher in tax receipts, because if tax rates get too high, people just produce less taxable income. And it's worth pointing out that government revenue drops sharply during recessions. That's those gray areas that you see there on the chart, the gray bars. And not only that, during those recessions, governments don't cut spending and usually, in fact, increase spending. They borrow more to help people through the hard times. So if we have a recession coming up, things are going to be worse than I say here. Now, other countries do have higher tax receipts to GDP numbers. The US is more comparable to these numbers if you add in state and local taxes to the federal tax burden. But this is the fairly constant number of the tax burden. Now, I think you can explain this by, the Laffer curve. The question for politicians is, what tax rate will get them the maximum revenue? Obviously, a zero tax rate doesn't work, because a zero tax rate yields no tax, and 100% tax rate also delivers zero revenue, because people just stop working when they can't keep any of the money they earned. So somewhere between 0 and 100% is the theoretical optimum tax rate that'll make the government its maximum revenue. That's at the point at the top of this curve, and it's called the Laffer curve. By the way, I've met Art Laffer. I had about 7 or 8 years ago, I actually had breakfast with him in Nashville. And at the time he was working on, he was consulting for a Middle Eastern company on how to maximize tax rates. So he really is a tax expert. He's an old guy now, but he's still alive. Now, Art Laffer doesn't take credit for this idea, by the way, this way to get optimum or maximum tax. This has been around for many, many years. It's been known to economists for a long time. But this Laffer curve concept was made famous in 1974 when he was at a meeting with Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, and he drew the curve on a napkin to make a point. And this economist named Jude Wanniski started calling it the Laffer curve. So that's how he got famous for this. Now I've got an interesting chart here that only goes up to 2010, but I couldn't find anything more recent. But what it does show is you cannot arbitrarily raise the tax rate to generate more tax revenue. Somewhere there's a limit beyond which an attempt to collect more taxes is counterproductive. And this chart shows for the last 75 years, tax revenue as a percent of GDP stayed constant, whether you made the top tax rate 90%, 60%, 40%, whatever. It just seems to be a barrier difficult to break. Maybe you can go higher. The point of this little explanation is there is a limit. Maybe the government could take 5% more, but there's a limit to what they can take. Now, so we can't raise the tax rate, but we can get more tax revenue if we increase nominal GDP. Because more tax revenue, if it's 20%, will then, be a 20% of a higher number. And so if you could raise that revenue, it would also give you a cushion so you could borrow more. So inflating GDP somehow is your best choice, your best source of increasing tax revenue. So, but now let's take a look at the other side, the cash expenses. I already stipulated that politicians don't want to cut entitlement spending, at least not visibly. So what's the other outflow? Interest costs. Now, I just want to have enough time here to point out that interest costs are going to be a big problem, and they are the immediate problem, because the politicians have to pay interest on the funded debt no matter what. They have to pay interest, and they can never default on that interest, or they become Argentina. They're unable to borrow again. So what we have here is a slide, a display of interest costs, and you see how they're going up. And they're now, this level on the far right is now $909 billion per year. That's bigger than the defense budget. And let's look at interest costs historically as a percent of GDP. Shown here, it doesn't look too bad, especially like in these years from 2000 up into the present. Because of low interest rates, interest costs as a percent of GDP were like less than 2%. So remember we said your interest cost as a percent of your income at 1%, that looked okay. And it looked okay here too. It was under 2% for many years. But why was that? Class? Because interest rates were declining. And you can see from 2000 to 2022, interest costs were manageable as a percentage of income. They were less than 2% of GDP, but this chart shows why that was so. For 40 years, the rising federal debt was offset by falling interest rates, keeping the total interest costs pretty flat. But that 40-year cycle of constantly falling interest rates was kind of a happy circumstance. I think it's over. And this is a long-term chart of interest rates. And I've added arrows in there to show that interest rates move in long, multi-decade secular patterns. Exactly why, I don't think is well understood. Certainly, the very low interest rates of recent years were definitely exacerbated by the Fed, made much lower than they would have been. But it appears to me that we've ended this most recent 40-year bull market in bonds, by which I mean a period of declining interest rates, and that's over. And there's a number of factors I could give you to support that. That's kind of a conjecture, but that's beyond the scope of today's lesson, and we can discuss a lot more of that in maybe session 8. But I think citizens need to pay attention to this interest rate trend. The government really got lucky for a while. They were able to borrow more and more because borrowing got cheaper almost every year for 40 years. And if you thought, as some economists and politicians apparently did, that interest rates would stay near zero forever, why wouldn't you borrow till the cows come home? Why wouldn't you? I mean, after all, if interest rates are zero, there's no limit to what you'd borrow at all. It's free. But now the game of refinancing federal debt at ever lower rates is over. The reverse is starting to take place. And as you can see on the far right of both these charts, both this chart and this chart, the interest rate on government debt has broken its downward trend. It's now rising rapidly, and it's unlikely to return to the near zero levels of the past few years. So I'll speed up a little bit here to give time for us to talk, and I want to end on time. These rates the interest costs are going to go up very quickly because we are refinancing debt that is still being paid at the old rates. The average duration, the average length of the cash flow, what's called durations, roughly approximate to maturity for U.S. public debt, is about 6 years. But a lot of this is front loaded, meaning that in a few years, a much higher level of debt is going to all be financed at much higher interest rates than today. For example, if we added 1.5 trillion to the debt, if you add that to the debt every year for the next 4 years, you'd have about 40 trillion in debt by 2028 at an average rate of 5% interest. That's $2 trillion in annual interest expense. And so, to see how quickly rising debt can overtake cash flow, here's a scenario that's put out by the Congressional Budget Office, which is always too conservative. You can see that they are assuming 3% interest rates, and the rate that the government is paying right now is 3.5%. And the current rates that we're sliding into are at least 5% and rising. And the CBO also has this history of underestimating deficits. Therefore, who knows if they're right about the debt that this interest rate will be paid on. But even under this rosy scenario, you get an insolvency ratio of over 20% in 10 years. By my calculation, it's 20% now. And they're saying it's going to, 909 billion in annual interest costs divided by 34 trillion, or I'm sorry, divided by the income that you get, 4 trillion, that comes out to about 22%. All right, so what CBO projects, even CBO, the conservative estimators, they project that by 2050, that's 27 years from now, interest costs are going to rise to 11.5% of GDP from the current 3.5% rate. But if I'm right that the government can only collect revenue of about 20% of GDP, this would mean that about 58% of government revenues, 58%, would be eaten up by interest payments. So that's an insolvency ratio of 58%. Obviously, we'll never get there. I submit that long before we get to that point, the bond market is going to sniff out that problem, and I think it's doing that right now. At some point, long before we get to those levels of interest, as a percentage of revenue, investors are only going to be willing to buy treasury bonds in return for a much higher interest rate. But that's self-defeating because higher interest rates will cause higher interest costs, accelerating pressure on the government's cash flow. So these rising interest costs really, to me, appear to be setting a big debt trap for the government, and they threaten to overwhelm the government's cash flow. And that's why I say, I mean, given this bleak picture, what alternatives does the government have? The only source of funds that can be increased that I see is to increase taxes by inflating GDP. That's the only inflow open to them. The only cash source. And the only outflow that's possibly under the government's control to suppress, if you agree with me that for the most part, the entitlements are going to be paid, the only outflow under the government's control is to put a lid on interest costs, which they can do by force. So in other words, I say it's in our politicians' interest to pump up GDP through inflation while suppressing interest rates to a level below the annual increase in the consumer price index. And this is called financial repression. It's already being implemented to a significant degree, and I think we're going to see more of it for perhaps for years. And in the next session, we'll detail exactly what a government policy of financial repression consists of, what kind of legislation, regulatory actions they can do to implement repression. And so that'll set us up to defend ourselves against it. Now, just to give you a quick example of a concrete example of what financial repression means. I'm going to give you an example of my friend John, who lives in Oklahoma. He's a retired school teacher. He's on a fixed pension, age 72. His pension comes from the state of Texas, which doesn't have any significant cost of living escalators in it. He owns a home, nice home with a low-cost mortgage, but not a whole lot of other assets. 3 years ago, 2019, 2020, he had a pretty comfortable surplus of income, enough to play golf and travel a little and so forth. But his cost of living in the last few years, that's food, energy, taxes, medical copays and so forth, are now up 25% over the last 3 years. And by his reckoning, at this rate, he's going to be living in an apartment in 10 or 15 years. Now, to offset this, to stay in his house, he's gone back to work at age 72 to make up for this lost purchasing power. He's not complaining about it, by the way, but this is what he has to do. So what's really happening here is that his purchasing power is being lost. And where is it going? It's being absorbed by new money, unproductive money that's being spent by the government and by the early recipients of that new money. So, for example, the pandemic giveaways to consumers gave those guys, the guys who got the money, new purchasing power, but took it away from my friend John in the form of higher prices, or you could say being able to get less product for the money that he has left to spend. So he's now working more, generating more nominal income, as well as more taxes to the government, just to maintain his standard of living. Now, that's a concrete example, a preview of how financial repression works. And as I say, it's already underway. And as we'll get into next lesson, I think it's going to intensify. Okay, so it looks like we did finish on time. Hey, Daniel, I did it. What questions or comments have we got? I hope I wasn't too, I skipped over a little bit as usual. I hope I wasn't too halting. Oh, in the manuscript I'm sending out, I have a number of interesting reading sources for you if you're ambitious. And I had to throw this in here. I found this debt bomb thing a while ago when the national debt was only 30 trillion. So I tried to update it there. good luck, kid. You're going to be financially repressed. And if you really are dying for more and more reading, there's a really good technical paper here by a guy who really gets it, I think, on increasing activism of central banks. I could have pulled off some great quotes out of there. Okay, I'm bantering on too much. Questions or comments, please?
I have a simple one. I'm not very clear on what it means, like the public debt or like monetizing public debt. Like, what does it concretely look like to monetize public debt?
Well, okay, so public debt just refers to the fact that the government borrows money from the public. That's what we mean by public debt.
Oh, okay.
So in other words,
So it's government debt, right?
yeah,
Okay.
it should be called government debt. Just like you shouldn't call them public schools, you should call them government schools. Yes. So it's the government's debt. Now, monetizing it consists of the simplest example is, suppose a bank, a commercial bank, suppose I own a treasury bond of $100,000, and the bank buys that treasury bond from me for its own investment. And so you know that when a bank, commercial bank, does this, they create a deposit. So now the bank acquires the bond, and in return, they give me brand new money that never existed before. That is a simple example of monetizing the debt. Now, is that clear?
And a treasury bond is this is when the treasury bond is being sold and bought by the government, right? But who? How?
The example I gave was, I bought the bond. I bought the bond. In other words, step one, I loaned money to the government of $100,000. The government now owes me interest and principal on that $100,000. That's what the bond is. It's that legal instrument that gives me the right to collect interest and principal from the government for $100,000. Okay.
Right.
Now that is a security, what's called, and that is negotiable. I can sell that to anyone I want, anyone who wants to buy it. Okay, that's step one. Government owes me money, and I have this bond, which is evidence of their obligation. Next, I sell that bond to a commercial bank, and the commercial bank creates new money to purchase that bond from me. So you see the net result there? The government still owes the money, but you've created money to pay for the bond. So that is called monetizing debt.
Oh.
Does that make sense?
Right, because now the commercial bank is involved. So earlier it was just you and the central bank or the Fed, and then now the commercial bank is involved, and commercial bank is buying from the individual and selling it to the central bank. No.
Remember, nope, not yet. Anytime a bank purchases an asset or makes a loan, which is the same as purchasing an asset, purchasing a promissory note. Anytime they do that, they create new money. That is how all our money is created, by
the good money, yes, and the money is destroyed. Good money destruction. When we're
talking about money being created here at this point. The act of purchasing an asset or making a loan means that the bank has created new money.
Right. But so if the asset, the treasury
when they buy a government bond, They are actually monetizing that government debt. They're turning it, they're reorganizing it in effect into money. In other words, the government owed me money. The bank just fixed it so that now they no longer owe me money, but now I have new money. Now, the central bank does this in massive quantities through QE by requiring the banks to do this and then purchasing the bonds from the banks. And then when they do that, they actually neutralize the interest payments. In that, you now have a government agency owning the bonds for which they paid for by creating new money. And when they get the interest payments, they turn around and give it right back to the Treasury. So it's a good racket. But this
Treasury
is how,
is distinct from the Fed or the central bank. Is the Treasury the same as the Fed or the central bank, or is it like different?
No, entirely different.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Treasury is simply the agency of the federal government that really does the borrowing and does the disbursements. They're like the I don't know. They would be like the treasurer or the CFO of whatever business you are in.
Okay, but in one way they are the same
collect
as
the money and pay it out.
Okay, in one sense they are the same. You can group them same as a Fed, right? Or the central bank. Like it's this when central bank gets the asset back.
The Treasury has no ability under current law, at least, to create money like the Fed and the banking system do.
Oh, okay.
They can borrow money. You know, they borrow money through auctions and so forth mainly, and then they collect taxes, and then they pay out the taxes back to bondholders in terms of interest. Plus, they pay out, government contractors and Social Security and all the government and defense and all the government expenses. But as we saw at the beginning here, they have to borrow in current rates about 25 to 30% of what they pay out every year. And the whole point of today was that's not sustainable.
Okay.
I have a question, if I may.
Yes, please.
So this might be one for next week, or it might be a naive or spectacularly dumb question for any week, but here goes.
Not possible. Go ahead.
Is it possible that all the major economies of the world could unilaterally agree to wipe out a given percentage of debt? And because they do it all simultaneously, that would lessen the fallout?
That is a very good question and an interesting proposal. And it's a logical one, and you're not the first to imagine it. Now, I think it's possible. I think it's unlikely that this is the first thing they'll try. I think a lot of countries would like to see if the United States gets to this unsustainability where it's impossible now to borrow in the Treasury market because the bond market's smoking it out, and they say, no, I can see that in a few years you're going to be insolvent, so I'm not buying anything today. I think there's a lot of countries that would like to see the USA twist in the wind for a while before they got involved in the reset. The only problem with that is that the fallout from the US twisting in the wind financially would be so bad for the rest of the world that it's possible that the major countries of the world, I'm talking about those with major central banks, the big economies, that would probably be, the G7, maybe the G20, probably not the G20, that includes some enemies. But, I could see the UK, possibly, the EU, the European Union, European Central Bank, the USA, Japan. I could see those four possibly doing what you're saying. and saying, let's have a great reset. We are going to reset everything we owe and cut it down to a fraction of what it is. We're all going to do it the same. That's possible. You could possibly have a big meeting like that. That might save the current system for a while. So I'd expect, though, that will be, if you got to that point, that the politicians will try to fix this with other means first. This won't be, that would not be the first thing they do. But that's a really interesting thought. And I don't know if it's a good idea, but it's an idea.
But doesn't so the
sorry,
that,
we need to wrap up.
all
Okay.
right.
All right, everybody. We'll see you next week. And for more on financial repression. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks, Dan.